My name is Eleanor, and it's been pouring a gloomy, relentless rain here in Seattle since morning. I'm standing by the massive glass window of my cabin on the 35th floor of my architectural firm, watching the hustle and bustle of the city below. The raindrops hitting the glass are creating a strange rhythmic music, but inside my mind, there is only a deafening silence. Behind me, on my large, immaculate mahogany desk, sits a brown envelope. It arrived just last evening from Chicago via a special courier. Stamped on that envelope is my father's company logo, a logo that once filled me with fear and anxiety. But today, 15 years later, looking at it only fills me with pity. Inside this envelope is a legal notice and a stack of documents. It's from my father. The very same father who, 15 years ago, right after my 22nd birthday, humiliated me in front of a packed room, making sure I knew I was an unwanted, useless piece of his massive, glittering empire. Today, the foundation of that invincible empire is crumbling, and he desperately needs me. He needs the help of the daughter he once deemed worthless, the one he kicked out of the house with nothing but an old suitcase. I still remember that bitter, dreadful night 15 years ago. Our sprawling mansion in Chicago's most affluent neighborhood was bathed in light. It was nothing short of a palace, dripping with priceless paintings, crystal chandeliers, and Italian marble. That night, a massive, lavish party was in full swing. My father had invited the city's top developers, politicians, bankers, and high society elites to celebrate the 25th anniversary of his real estate empire. I was 22 and had just graduated with a degree in architecture with top honors. I harbored a tiny sliver of hope that now, with my education complete, my father might finally carve out a place for me in his business. I thought he might hand me a project where I could prove my worth. But what happened that night altered the course of my life forever. The party was at its peak. The clinking of champagne glasses and the hollow laughter of rich men echoed everywhere. Suddenly my father took the microphone. The entire hall went pin-drop silent. He talked about his journey, boasted about his successes, and then, out of nowhere, called my older brother Richard up to the stage. Richard had always been the golden boy. He was arrogant and took sick pleasure in putting people down, but my father believed those were the exact traits you needed to survive in business. Right there on the mic, my father announced that his entire business, all his wealth, and all his future projects would now belong to Richard. It stung, but it wasn't a massive shock because I always knew he saw Richard as his heir. But he didn't stop there. Handing Richard the crown wasn't enough. He had to tear me down in the process. He pointed at me in front of the entire crowd and laughed, saying that business requires ruthlessness and the guts to make hard calls, and that Eleanor was just too emotional. He told everyone I lacked the fire, and the cunning needed to survive in the real world. With that, he snapped his fingers at a servant. The servant brought out an old, dusty leather suitcase that had belonged to my grandmother, rotting away in the basement for years. My father dropped it in front of me and announced over the mic that this was my inheritance. He said I was probably only good for picking out curtains and doodling little designs. He told me to pack my dreams in this suitcase and go find a job where people only care about feelings, not brains. Almost everyone in the room laughed. My own relatives, my father's friends, his business partners, they were all laughing at me. Richard stood there holding his wine glass, looking at me with a toxic, arrogant smirk. My mother, who had always stayed silent during my father's worst decisions, stood there looking at the floor, silent as ever. Have you ever felt like the very family you belong to, the people who share your blood, turned you into a total laughingstock in front of the whole world? In that moment, it felt like someone had driven a dagger straight through my chest. But I made a promise to myself right then and there. I would not let them see me cry. I held back my tears. I simply picked up that dusty old suitcase, walked up the stairs with heavy steps, and went to my room. I opened my closet, but I didn't take a single expensive dress or piece of jewelry they had bought me. I packed a few basic clothes, my favorite architecture books, my drafting tools, and a few $100 I had saved up. Without saying a word to anyone, without looking back, I walked out of that house forever. My father didn't even try to stop me. His ego probably convinced him that the real world would chew me up and spit me out. And within 2 days I'd come crawling back in tears, ready to live as his obedient puppet. But I left Chicago for good. I went to the bus station, bought a ticket to Seattle, and embarked on a long journey into the unknown. I had no trust fund, no safety net. All I had was a heart that had been broken so ruthlessly that I was no longer afraid of anything the world could throw at me. My early days in Seattle were so fraught with struggle that even today, thinking about them brings tears to my eyes. I lived in a tiny, damp basement apartment, working myself to the bone just to make rent. I took a job as a waitress in a small diner. I cleared half-eaten plates, mopped floors, and at night, when my body was completely exhausted, I would sit at my tiny table and draft building designs. I worked for peanuts at small, no-name drafting firms, but I never threw in the towel. I learned something new every single day. There was a unique kind of truth and depth in my designs, and slowly, people started to notice. To me, architecture wasn't just a way to construct buildings. It was my way of rebuilding myself. In school, I learned that a building isn't just made of bricks, cement, and stone. It is built on integrity, balance, and an unbreakable foundation. If the foundation is flawed, no matter how beautiful the building looks from the outside, it will eventually collapse. My father's empire was built on lies, deceit, and corruption, but I vowed that whatever I built would stand on a rock-solid foundation of truth. After years of grueling hard work, sacrificing sleep, and facing countless hurdles, I launched my own boutique firm. At first, I only got tiny projects, but I poured my heart and soul into every single one. Thanks to my integrity and the quality of my work, the bigger contracts started rolling in. Today, 15 years later, my firm is one of the most prestigious and successful architectural companies in Seattle. We design some of the city's most significant landmarks. We build structures that are eco-friendly and serve the community. I had left my past far behind me. I had a wonderful life, great friends, and most importantly, I had the self-respect my father had tried so hard to strip away. I truly thought the dark shadow of Chicago would never touch me again. But the past never truly leaves you alone. It knocks on your door when you least expect it. A few weeks ago, on an otherwise normal workday, after 15 years of dead silence, my office door swung open, and in walked my brother, Richard. Right behind him was my father. Seeing them in my office felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. They wore their usual expensive suits, but their walk lacked that old arrogance. Their faces were lined with age, but what stood out more than the wrinkles was a thinly veiled panic and desperation. They sat down in the chairs directly across from me. At first, my father tried to play it cool, awkwardly mentioning they were in town for a business meeting and just wanted to see me after all these years. He complimented my office and feigned happiness for my success. But I wasn't a naive little girl anymore. I knew they didn't fly out 15 years later just to catch up or celebrate my victories. After a few minutes of fake pleasantries, the real reason finally slipped out. I learned that Richard's constant string of terrible decisions, his unquenchable greed, his reckless spending, and my father's blind arrogance had pushed their massive empire to the absolute brink of bankruptcy. They were drowning in millions of dollars of debt owed to several major banks. The government and tax agencies were breathing down their necks, deeply investigating their projects. Their entire business was a house of cards ready to collapse any day. But there was a massive twist in this story. 15 years ago, shortly before they kicked me to the curb, my father had tried to evade taxes and hide some shady assets by transferring a barren, swampy, useless piece of land on the outskirts of Chicago into my name. At the time, the land was practically worthless, and I had absolutely no idea he had even done it. But today, 15 years later, thanks to rapid urban expansion and a new highway, that barren land was sitting dead center in the city's most expensive and lucrative commercial zone. Today, that land was worth tens of millions of dollars, enough to wipe out all their debts. And the best part? Legally, that land belonged solely and exclusively to me. They couldn't sell a single inch of it without my signature. My father pulled a thick file from his briefcase and slid it across my desk. His lawyers had already drawn up all the paperwork, which explicitly stated that I was voluntarily returning this multi-million-dollar property to the family company for absolutely nothing in return. My father put on an incredibly emotional, award-worthy performance. He talked about how blood is thicker than water, how family is the only thing you have in tough times. He pleaded that if I just signed these papers, I would save his life's work and the family's honor. He even dangled a carrot, promising me a small stake in the company and inviting me to move back to Chicago. Richard played the diplomatic peacemaker, smoothly adding, "Eleanor, the smart thing to do is let bygones be bygones. What's done is done. It's time we move forward as a family." I listened to them with absolute calm. I didn't show a single ounce of anger. I simply told them I needed some time to review the documents and think it over. They gave me 48 hours and left. After they walked out, I stared at those papers for a long time. Then I called in the sharpest, most trusted attorney from my firm's legal team, and together we tore through those documents, scrutinizing every single line and every single word. We also pulled a full history of the property and the current financial reality of my father's company. Being an architect has taught me that blueprints and documents never lie. If you look closely enough, every tiny line, every hidden clause, and every signature tells a story. When we dug deep into those documents, the terrifying truth that surfaced was far uglier than my father simply going bankrupt. They didn't just want that multi-million-dollar land back. Their lawyers had cleverly buried fine print and hidden clauses in those documents that would essentially transfer the legal and criminal liability of all my father's financial crimes, tax evasion, fraud, and the company's impending bankruptcy straight onto my shoulders along with the land transfer. They weren't saving me from debt. They were setting me up as the ultimate scapegoat so they could walk away clean and avoid federal prison. If I signed those papers, I wouldn't just lose my land. I could very well go to prison for their crimes. They honestly thought that the terrified, humiliated little girl from 15 years ago was still just as foolish. They assumed I'd get emotional over the mention of family and love, and blindly sign the papers without reading them. Finding this out didn't make me angry. I didn't want to scream or shout. Instead, a deep, ice-cold peace washed over me. It's the kind of peace that settles in when you finally realize that some people, no matter how good of an act they put on, will never change. Their poison is in their veins forever. I decided right then that I was going to do exactly what they had always said I couldn't do. I was going to be ruthless. But my ruthlessness wouldn't be rooted in deceit and fraud like theirs. My ruthlessness would be rooted in truth, facts, and justice. My lawyers and I worked around the clock for the next 48 hours. We compiled a massive, airtight dossier. I gathered concrete evidence of every single one of their financial frauds, illegal transactions, tax evasions, and their unauthorized use of my name over the years. Simultaneously, I took every necessary legal step to establish absolute control and ownership of that land. I had made up my mind. I was going to beat them at their own game, speaking their own language. On Friday morning, our final meeting was set in a massive boardroom at a high-end, luxurious law firm in downtown Seattle. When I walked in, my father, Richard, and their entire army of lawyers were already there. They looked incredibly confident. There was a smug, victorious glow on their faces. They fully believed that the quiet, emotional architect from Seattle would cave under their pressure and the weight of the family name and quietly sign her life away. The meeting began. My father pulled a ridiculously expensive gold pen from his pocket, slid the papers toward me, and said in a sickeningly sweet voice, "Eleanor, honey, just sign at the bottom and this whole nightmare will be over. We'll start fresh, like a real family." I remained perfectly still in my large leather chair. I didn't touch his gold pen. I opened my bag and pulled out the thick dossier I had prepared. I casually pushed his fraudulent documents aside and placed my dossier directly in front of his lead attorney. In a very calm yet unshakable voice, I said, "I am not signing these papers." A dead silence fell over the massive boardroom. You could hear a pin drop. Richard leaned forward in his chair, his face turning beet red. Suppressing a scream, he hissed, "Are you out of your mind, Eleanor? Do you have any idea what you're doing? If you don't sign these, our company goes under. We'll be on the streets. The family name will be dragged through the mud." I looked him dead in the eye with absolute serenity and said, "The family name was dragged through the mud 15 years ago, Richard. That night when you and Father turned me into a public joke." I looked at my father. All the color had drained from his face. His hands were shaking because his lead attorney was frantically flipping through the pages of my dossier, and the sheer panic on the lawyer's face made it clear that I had caught them red-handed. I turned to my father and said, 15 years ago, in a room full of people, you said I didn't have the ruthlessness required to run a successful business. You were absolutely right, Dad. I never had the ruthlessness to commit fraud, to lie, and to send my own family members to prison. But I do have the strength and the brains not to carry the burden of your mistakes, your crimes, and your sins on my shoulders. The swampland you put in my name to dodge taxes is legally mine today, mine alone. And I am not giving it back to you at any price. And if you or your lawyers try to pressure me, or blackmail me in any way, all of this rock-solid evidence I have here will go straight to federal investigators and the IRS. Then, you won't just be worried about bankruptcy, you'll be worried about spending years behind bars. Hearing this, Richard jumped out of his chair and started screaming like a maniac, calling me an ungrateful, greedy, selfish brat who betrayed her own family for money. But my father was dead silent. He sank into his chair as if someone had just knocked the wind out of him. He looked at me as if he was seeing me for the very first time in his life. It finally dawned on him that the emotional, weak girl he had kicked out with an old suitcase 15 years ago had grown into a woman strong and smart enough to obliterate his entire fake world with a single strike. I calmly stood up. I slung my bag over my shoulder. I turned to look at them one last time and said, "You gave me an empty, dusty suitcase as my inheritance. I filled that suitcase with my hard work, my dedication, my integrity, and my unbreakable self-respect. You can keep your fake, hollow, deceitful legacy. I don't need a single piece of it." I turned around, pushed open those heavy boardroom doors, and walked out. When I stepped out onto the street, the cold Seattle breeze hit my face. On that day, it felt like the freshest, most comforting air in the world. It felt as though a crushing 15-year-old boulder had finally been lifted off my chest forever. I was free. Totally and completely free. Over the next few months, exactly what I anticipated came to pass. My father's massive empire, built entirely on a foundation of lies, collapsed like a house of cards. His old investors hit him with massive fraud lawsuits, and the bank seized all his properties, including that palatial mansion. Richard had to surrender his luxury cars and his lavish lifestyle. Investigating agencies froze all their accounts. During those months, they tried to contact me relentlessly. They sent emails, showed up outside my office, threw threats at me, and eventually got on their knees and begged. But I never answered a single call or replied to a single message. I didn't file any fake lawsuits against them. I didn't seek revenge. I simply left them to their fate, to suffer the consequences of their own actions and suffocate in the very trap they had set for others. Sometimes, saving yourself and quietly stepping away is the most brutal and terrifying punishment you can inflict on someone. You might be wondering what I did with that multi-million-dollar piece of land. I didn't sell it to a developer for a massive commercial mall, a 5-star hotel, or a corporate high-rise, even though I was offered astronomical sums for it. Instead, through my architectural firm and under my direct supervision, I designed and built a beautiful, state-of-the-art, eco-friendly community center and a vocational training school. Today, it stands as a place where young men and women who were rejected by their families or by society, who were told they were worthless and would never amount to anything, can learn architecture, design, and other valuable skills completely free of charge. There are no lies, no tax evasion, and no deceit in the foundation of that building. There is only truth, hope, and the drive to build a better tomorrow. Whenever I stand in the grand courtyard of that building and watch those kids laughing and learning, I am reminded of my old suitcase. That suitcase still sits safely in the storage room of my house today. To me, it is no longer a symbol of humiliation, pain, or rejection. It is the ultimate symbol of my freedom, my strength, and my identity. That suitcase reminds me every single day that when your own people, your own family, try to tell you that you have no value, that you are unworthy, you do not need to waste your time fighting them. You don't need to beg them for a certificate of your worth. All you have to do is turn around, walk in a new direction, and build a world so strong that their inflicted pain and narrow-mindedness hold absolutely no power over you. I've learned that relationships aren't just forged by blood, they are forged by respect, honesty, and unbreakable trust. And the people who claim to love you at the expense of your self-respect, who only want to keep you bent to their will, don't actually love you. They just want to control you. I didn't share this long, painful story so you would hate my father or my brother. Karma has already handed them their sentence. I told this story so that if any of you are standing at a crossroads right now, forced to choose between your self-respect and a toxic, controlling relationship, you know that sometimes walking away empty-handed, leaving it all behind, is the most powerful and correct step you can take. Your worth is not determined by what you inherit. It is determined by what you build with your own two bare hands. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this story, and for listening to my journey so patiently. I truly hope my journey has given you something to think about, granted you a little courage, and firmly convinced you that no one else in this world gets to determine your worth or your value, even if they are your own family. If you connected with this story, if you saw a reflection of yourself in it, and you'd like to hear more honest, deep, and heartwarming stories in the future, please like this video and be sure to subscribe to our beloved channel, Book Bite Studio. Your love and support are what give us the courage and inspiration to bring these untold stories to you. Take great care of yourselves, recognize your worth, and always stand firm in your truth.